This presentation was delivered on several occasions in 2019. The original was one 45-minute presentation. I have edited it and recorded it here in April 2020 as 3 parts. This is part 3. All poems were written by the author in the fall of 2018. This is part 3 of a 3-part presentation called Casualty of Research. I invite you to look for the other 2 parts. When I left you in part 2, we were in Europe. I continue in Europe as we start part 3. We went to put Acadia-colored ribbons on one grave, that of Henry Hoyt Penniot, just days before the 100th anniversary of his death. I had read a note saying that Penniot was, quote, buried in a little Belgian town, unquote. Mr. Penniot graduated in 1912 and was a favorite of President Cutton. I knew that putting Acadia ribbons on his grave would be very emotional, but this time was special. We had visited many cemeteries before this one to put Acadia-colored ribbons on graves, and each time the routine was the same. The cemetery is divided into sections and rows. There is a book at the gate which lists the graves and provides an address. The rows are relatively easy to figure out. The sections are more difficult. Our process was to split up, find the section, and either call out or put up your hand to indicate that you had found who you were looking for. Our guide was a former Air Force officer and well experienced with finding graves. That morning in Popperin, he found Penniot before me, but I happened to be watching as he stood before Captain Penniot, his superior officer, came to attention, saluted him, bowed his head, and then put up his hand to indicate that he had found the grave. I instantly went to tears with the realization that he had likely shown this respect to our boys every single time we found a grave, but I was always too busy searching to notice his act of reverence and respect. Mount Sorrel, Hill 70. We arrived here 100 years to the day that this battle was raging. Standing on the German position, our guide read from a book called The 85th in France and Flanders. It reads like a playbook for some sports team. As he pointed out from where the Canadians attacked the hill, I called out names of our boys who were in those attacking forces. It was like I could see and hear the battle. I still can. Henry Hoyt Penniot was there. He was coming up on our left with the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. Many others from Acadia were also with the 5th CMR. After, we walked down to the German trench on our right. We looked out over the field where the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry attack came and was pushed back. Don Chase, Cyril March, and Stanley Livingston Jones were coming up on our right with the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. All 3 were taken prisoner right there in front of us. Stanley Livingston Jones graduated in 1897. He was experienced as he'd fought in the Boer War. He joined the PPCLI in 1914 and was one of the first Canadians to reach France. We had visited his grave in Marcio just a few days before Major Jones's death. I had grown attached to Stanley and knew this visit would be emotional. I told our guide in advance. He brought me to the grave and quietly left me alone. Marcio Military Cemetery is behind some row houses next to a soccer field and bordered by a playground. I was amazed. Military cemeteries are so common along the Western Front. As you drive past one, another is on the horizon. They are in the middle of towns and in the middle of fields. They are completely commonplace. And they are all beautiful in their own way. Our last stop was Wimereux Communal Cemetery. It's right in the middle of town. There is a military section near the bottom of the cemetery. Men and women are here, all ranks, all ages, all nationalities, because it is a hospital cemetery. Wimereux haunted me. It took quite a while for me to understand why. It's the stones. They lie down, like fallen soldiers. The other cemeteries have standing stones, like marching armies. Frederick Charles Manning is buried here. I placed my final Acadia-colored ribbons on his grave. Just after I did, I looked around, paralyzed. I could not walk away from them. I was going home. They were remaining here. My guilt was overwhelming. I was practically dragged to the vehicle so we could catch the ferry to England, and then I was upset the entire ferry ride back as passengers tried not to stare at me. What happened in that cemetery? I wrote a poem about it. It's called The Promise. I stood there, unable to leave them, frozen, mourning, guilty. They knew, all of them lying there in that unfamiliar ground, cold, windswept, beautiful. Today I leave. Today I go home. Home to the familiar. They will not. They cannot leave this beautiful, terrible, peaceful place. And for a moment, neither can I. He knows. He knows I must leave. I must return to the familiar. I must be their voice. Go, tell them about us, he whispers. In tears, I promise, I will. And I took my leave of him. October 2018.